Welcome to Tales at Scale, a podcast that cracks open the world of analytics projects. I'm your host, Rena from Imply, and I'm here to bring you stories from developers doing cool things with Apache Druid, real-time data, and analytics, but way beyond your basic BI. I'm talking about analytics applications that are taking data and insights to a whole new level. Today, we're taking a little bit of a departure from use cases and projects to talk about, well, how you talk about use cases and projects. As developers, most of your time is spent building, figuring things out, making things work. But how do you talk about your work? How do you explain how you fixed an issue or share something cool that you tried? How do you come up with what to write about in the first place? Or even how do you present your ideas in front of an audience? To help answer these questions, my guest today is Hellmar Becker, prolific Druid blogger and sales engineer at Imply. Hellmar, welcome to the show.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I always like to ask my guests a little bit about their background and how you got to where you are today. So can you tell us a little bit about how you became an amazing Druid blogger and sales engineer at Imply?
Rena. Well, it's a long story. I've been with Imply for the better part of the last 3 years. I've been in the data space for more than 20 years. I used to do what used to be called web analytics back in the day, and then multi-channel analytics and various other names, clickstream analytics, if you will. I've worked at a bank at one time. Then the big data hype came out. I worked for some time at Hortonworks, the big data company, which was the first time I actually encountered Druid. And from there, I went to Confluent, the Kafka folks, and then to Imply, and here I am. And I've done pre-sales for the better part of the last 10 years.
So you were familiar with Apache Druid before you came to Imply?
Well, familiar is probably saying a little bit too much, but I was one of the few people who had heard about it, yes.
So we've been talking a lot on the show about how Druid has changed in the last year or so, especially with the addition of like the MSQ framework. We're on the horizon of 26.0 and 27.0, I believe, this year. One thing that you wrote about on your blog is Windows functions. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, window functions are, I think they're an essential part of modern SQL and modern analytics, and it was about time for Druid to offer those as well. What you do with window functions is you relate rows into groups, looking forward, looking back, and you create aggregations without only having a main aggregation. So things like having a ranking inside buckets of values, or things like putting clicks together into a session, finding out how does the revenue of an online store relate from today to yesterday's revenue. All these things are answered with window functions. One of the most important and intriguing use cases is funnel analysis, where you follow the journey of a user of any kind of service through a sequence of steps, and it's crucial that these steps occur in a certain sequence in time. Mm-hmm. To answer these kinds of questions, you use window functions.
And I heard that the community was pretty excited about this one.
Everyone is excited. So, I'm standing with one foot in the community, doing the open source and developer related stuff. With the other foot, I stand in the commercial side of things, where we see customers that actually use Druid for mission critical use cases, and they're also excited about it.
So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show today is actually more about the community aspect, because you maintain a really popular Apache Druid blog, which I like to just refer to as the Druid Cookbook, because sometimes you've called your posts that. What made you decide to start your own blog to talk about these things?
That's a really great question, Rena. I think what happened was that when I first joined Imply more than 2 years ago, I have to say our documentation left some things to be desired. Yeah, so there were a lot of things that were undocumented or a bit obscure or were lacking practical examples. So oftentimes I came across a situation where I wanted to find out how something works, and then I couldn't find it in the documentation. That irked me. So I thought, okay, I am going to try and find it out. So I set up an experiment, usually with a little kind of showcase, a little data set, and I try to figure out how things actually work. And then, because when I figure something out, and then 2 weeks later I don't know anymore how it worked, and I don't like that. So I take notes, and then while I was at it anyway, I thought, why not publish those notes, and so that others can benefit from it as well. That's how it all started. And then the other thing was, of course, also trying to kick myself into the rear part and making sure that once I start to think of discipline, to maintain a certain cadence or a certain frequency. And once you do that, then you get into this mode where, every time you add a tiny little bit, and it's all tiny little bits, and then you look at it at the end of the day, and all of a sudden you have something.
Well, how do you determine, what experiments you want to do? Like, how do you find what you're going to write about next or what you want to try next? You're kind of like a Druid scientist in a way.
Yeah, but I wouldn't take all the credit for that, because mostly it comes from the field. It comes from customers. It comes from the community. People ask questions because, like me, when I first started the blog, there are a lot of other people out there that just say, I want to know if we can do this or that within Druid, or I want to know how it works, or if I'm in this kind of scenario, what happens? How does the software behave? And they don't know, and they don't know how to figure it out. I mean, I'm kind of intrigued by many of these questions, and then I set out and try to find out.
What do you do if something you try just doesn't work? Do you still document that?
It depends. So sometimes, well, first of all, every blog, I try to keep my blog posts short, and I think we are probably talking about that a little bit later, how to set the bar at the right kind of height, because when you start writing a blog and then you aim at writing the next version of War and Peace, then there's a danger that you never get started. So every blog post, that usually I document the happy path, but to every blog post that I write, I should probably write a kind of side or companion blog where I document all the things, how they can go wrong and how I went wrong in the first place and had to backtrack and try a different thing. So that is one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is sometimes, because some of my experiments are actually at the bleeding edge. So I do not only take the released code, but I also pull the source code as it is right now from GitHub, and I build the latest and greatest additions, and I try to experiment with it. And then there is a chance that sometimes things don't work at all. Now, the way I organize my blog, there is the posts, which are in one directory on my GitHub, and then there are the drafts. And sometimes drafts can be sitting there for quite a while, because at the moment when I first had that idea, I hit a snag and I couldn't resolve it because the software just hasn't been ready. And then sometimes I revisit these drafts 2 or 3 months later and make them into a published post then.
I think that's important, though, because, you don't want to just throw in the towel because you hit a snag. And that's actually one of the beauty of open source software, is that, something might not be working right this very second, but there are folks working on it so that it does work in the future. It just might not be ready. And you're testing things out early anyway, so you might run into that.
Right. And the other thing, Rena, is that because I'm with Imply, and so I have all these connections, I can file requests to our product and engineering teams. And then sometimes I write down, I've tried this and this and this, and it didn't work. And I get very, very positive feedback, because then the folks in engineering said, oh, yeah, we never had that idea, but this is actually a bug that needs to be fixed. And then they fix it.
Essentially, you're helping make Druid better that way, though, because you're finding things. And that's like kind of another point of open source, is to, find the bugs, find the fixes, make the technology continuously better.
I'm very happy if it works out like this, yeah.
So if someone wants to, like, they're working in Druid or they're working in another technology and they want to start writing about it, how do they get started? What would you recommend, some tips for them?
Oh, there are various tips. I mean, I've been talking to some of my colleagues. Many of my Imply colleagues have now started their own blogs. Probably the lowest threshold approach is to use one of those ready-made platforms that are out there. You could use, if you're old-fashioned, you would use something like WordPress. The more modern ways would be Medium or Substack or anything like that. There are also developer-related similar websites that just get you started. And now that is, of course, when you are on such a platform, then the platform kind of owns the content. So that's not how I do it. I run my own server. So it's a virtual server at a hosting provider. On that server, I have my own web server. I'm running Jekyll, which is a static site generator, but you don't have to go all that way. So that's for the technical setup. Like I said, there are lots of platforms that you can start with without putting in a lot of effort. The other thing is, it's important to really keep the bar relatively low at the beginning. I think when I talk to my colleagues, many of them feel that they have to create something perfect and something really elaborate in the beginning, and that can be scary. I try to go back to the idea of the what blogging was supposed to be when it first came up, like 15 years ago, when a blog, well, a web log as it's literally translated, was something like a kind of virtual diary where you wrote down short notes as they came to your mind.
I had a live journal. I get you. I'm from that generation.
yeah. And I mean, you're not trying to write War and Peace. You're not trying to win the Pulitzer Prize. It's just you want to get something out that can be relatively raw in a way, and that is also valid for a certain point in time only. So if you go back to some of my blog posts from 1.5 years ago, then they might not be valid anymore because they describe a particular workaround that was necessary at that time, and by now that has been overcome by more recent versions. But yeah, it is like a kind of time capsule for that point in time, and I don't go back and change it. It's a log, so it's also an immutable thing.
I mean, this kind of like hurts my heart to say this, but like there's a difference between, say, writing for your company and then maintaining your own personal blog. Why would you choose to maintain your own personal blog instead of putting all of your knowledge into a corporate blog?
Well, I mean, I don't want to hurt anyone, but
it's a spicy question for me.
it's a spicy question, yeah, in a way. Well, usually with a corporate blog also comes a process of vetting and approvals and people who want to be asked and specific formatting rules and well, basically lots of hoops to jump through before you even get started. And again, I want to keep it easy. And the second thing is I'm also true to the open source idea. So all my blog content is in my blog for anybody to use. It's also in GitHub if anybody wants to use the Markdown code. And actually Imply has decided in the past a few times to cross-post my blog post to the company blog, which I'm happy if it happens. Yeah.
It's usually like the larger stories or something that's, more detailed, or rather than just the logs. And I think that's like a great opportunity to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
Here's another question. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier. So what's the difference between, say, documentation and then, documenting your work on a blog? Because I feel like a lot of developers are familiar with documentation and some of them have written it, or at least everyone has used it. But what would be the difference between focusing your writing efforts on documentation versus blogging?
Documentation, Rena, documentation is, I think, something that really has to be prim and proper. It has to be properly formatted. It has to supposedly cover all the aspects. So there is a higher standard that you put to documentation, which is why there are full-time specialists who write documentation. For me, my blog is like a side gig, something that sometimes I put in like 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon to write.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's part of it too. Like, if you're writing for yourself, it's to establish your own voice, showcase your work. Like, it's all about it, and it should be fun, right? It's fun to figure things out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes if there's a gap in the documentation, then I write a blog, and then somebody from the docs team approaches me and says, "Hey, Hellmar, can we use your content and reformat it a bit and put that in the documentation?" I say, "Yeah, sure." I'm happy about that as well.
Okay, so speaking about like personal voice and shifting gears a little bit, I know that you don't just write a blog and maintain a blog, but you also present, and you speak at a lot of different meetups, not just their Druid ones. How do you go about presenting at different meetups and getting involved in that way?
That is actually many questions in one question, Rena. First thing is how to find out what is the right kind of content to present. That comes often also from my experience in the field, from my experience with community members, with customers, the questions that they ask, and they often lead to something like creating a demo or creating a little showcase. And then again, it's important to make this into a story. So that is one thing. The other thing is how to find opportunities. Well, once you have a network in that kind of community, then you also find the opportunities. So I look for meetups in my neighborhood. Well, I hope there will be more open source Druid meetups in the future.
And you're in Berlin, for anybody listening, right?
I'm in Berlin, but that is actually, interestingly, this is an open source infrastructure meetup that is it's organized by a company called Ivan, who offer Kafka as a cloud service. And I know the community manager that is organizing this meetup, and I said, hey, how about I speak at your meetup? And she says, yeah, that's a great idea. And that is how it usually happens. Same with conferences.
So you're saying, if somebody sees a meetup that seems interesting, even if it's not exactly Druid related, just to reach out and see.
Well, the thing is, some organizations or some meetup organizers actually try to keep themselves friendly, and they write a note in the meetup description page saying that even if you are a first-time speaker, even if you don't have a lot of experience, this is a friendly forum where you can try yourself out. So it's not like you have to stand in front of 250 people and do a big show at whatever Kafka summit, but you are within a small, friendly space with 20, 30 people where you can also practice a bit. And I would absolutely underwrite that. And it can't hurt reaching out and making contact with the organizers. They are usually very friendly, and many are happy to find and get new content presenters, fresh faces.
Do you have any meetups coming up that you wanna promote here? Because I feel like you always have something going on.
I have a lot going on, but yeah, like you said, so on the 24th of May, it's not quite official yet, but then I'll be speaking in Berlin. There is probably something coming, a big data event in Budapest in Hungary. And I've also got a conference talk in Lithuania set up for November. So that is what I have currently on the radar. And there's one or the other thing still coming within the next months.
And a quick question for you. So for folks who are listening who, shockingly, maybe have never tried out Druid or don't know how to use Druid, how would you recommend that they get started, playing around with it and figuring it out?
There is a lot of content nowadays, starting with Imply's Quick Start tutorial. We've got a Druid Academy that is also sponsored by Imply, but that is completely open source. Yeah, just get started, follow the tutorials. At some point, use your own data. So usually the simple tutorials start with 1 day's worth of Wikipedia edits. There's a bunch of other free data sets out there. At some point, you will want to play around with live streaming data ingestion. Then you may want to set up your own. There are free data generators out there. And again, many of these community folks and DevRel folks that work in the data streaming space, they also take fun in writing little scripts that do these data simulations.
Didn't you just do one with like flight data for your blog?
That would be exactly, but that would have been the next thing. You're giving me a great segue here. So what I did is I have probably a lot of people. I've got this little Raspberry Pi that is sitting on my desk at my house and listening to flight radar data. So basically, it sees whenever an airplane is flying over my house and collects the data and creates a little live stream that goes then into a Kafka Confluent service. And that is one of the sets of demo data. Actually, I think Darren, our tech marketing guy, he just asked me a couple of days ago, Hellmar, can I use your data stream? I said, yeah, of course. Here you go.
Oh, yeah, I think that actually was used in a webinar. I think we used your data to do a demo.
People might be a bit surprised why all these flight data are based around Munich in Germany, but that's why. It's because it's all collected at my house.
I mean, I could do that. I'm under a flight path in Boston, the Logan International Airport.
You could, and if you have a Raspberry Pi, well, if you already have one, because right now I heard they're a bit hard to get by, unfortunately. But if you have one, and if you have a flight data collector, then I can give you that little piece of software, which I wrote, that connects these flight data to the Kafka stream that we are running in Imply's Confluent Cloud.
But if for some reason you don't have a Raspberry Pi and you don't live under a main flight path, there are lots of other data streams and data sets available that you can use to test. Although that does seem fun making your own. I think that's going to do it for us today. Hellmar, this was great. I feel very inspired, and now I want to kind of map the plains above my house. But thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
So if you want to know anything else about Druid or get started yourself, visit druid.apache.org. And if you want to learn more about Imply or check out our documentation on Druid, please visit imply.io. Until next time, keep it real.